Hey y'all, sorry to have to cancel class today. I got summoned to daycare with a sick child, and if you hear in the background some ridiculous PBS kids show, she's sitting here watching television so I can prepare for class. I want to kind of walk you through this article on Wordsworth to suggest some ways that you might go about reading literary criticism. Um, First, let's talk about the front page we get here from JSTOR, which is short for Journal Storage. You can learn a number of things from this. First, you've got the title of the article right here. Um, the author, of course, is James Shokoff, and if you do a Google search on him, you'll find that he is a professor of English at the State University of New York in Fredonia, so he's got some credentials for writing this. We get the journal title, we get the volume, the number, the year, and the inclusive page numbers. Um, This is important in part because if you don't see volume and page numbers, you likely are not dealing with an academic journal. You're dealing with probably some other sort of kind of source. There are times when that's appropriate, but for our purposes today, we want to know that this is a good academic source. You can see that we're dealing with a journal published by the University of Illinois Press, and that's the main kinds of stuff we get from the title page. Moving into the article itself, pay attention to the title. It gives you some clues that are useful. Um, Usually an article like this begins with some sort of an introduction, and Shokoff begins with Wordsworth's own introduction of the poems in the lyrical ballads. He then moves on to something that is fairly typical, which is just an overview of the trends in literary criticism on his particular topic. You can see he says that for the most part, Wordsworth has been interpreted through the lens of novelty. We're talking about the new things that Wordsworth is doing, why he is such a revolutionary poet. Shokoff, in contrast, wants to show that Wordsworth was not just a poet about newness, but also one who followed a very long tradition of teaching through poetry. And I've noted here on my first read through, I thought that this right here might be the writer's thesis, but at this point I wasn't entirely sure. This does make a claim about Wordsworth, but I'm not sure if it's the main claim that Shokoff is going to make. But I've noted it so that I can come back to it. As we continue, Shokoff discusses this idea of duty and says, okay, so we have a problem. The idea of duty is not clearly defined in the preface to the lyrical ballads. But if we go elsewhere to Wordsworth's other works, we can figure out what exactly duty means. And that's what he does in this paragraph, is to show how this idea of duty is carried out elsewhere. At this point, we get down to here, we get this sentence. These concerns, these ideas about Newton's idea of the universe and the problems that it creates, are apparent in many of Wordsworth's poems and offer some supporting evidence that his duty as a poet was to find, amid the new disorder of things, comfort for the prospect of what Andrew Marvell called deserts of vast eternity. And I noted here that that sentence that I've circled is not really the thesis, but it confirms my sense that that sentence on the page before was, in fact, the writer's thesis. The next paragraph introduces a whole long section of the paper on the poem We Are Seven. In some ways, this is not an essay about We Are Seven. It's about Wordsworth's idea of what a poet's duty is. We Are Seven is just one of the two poems that Shokoff uses to prove this point. Nevertheless, within this section, you can expect to see smaller versions of many of the same things that we've already seen. A claim, a rehearsal of what the critical trends have been, etc. And you see a brief summary of the poem. Then you see him start in on that work of showing who the critics are and what they have said. And then, as we move forward, Shokoff does something that I really want you to really pay attention to. He uses one of those critics. It's not just saying, here's who has talked about these things. He instead says that the way that this critic Ferguson has talked about the poem, that helps me to get into my discussion in a very important way. And he does that right here. And I'm sorry, I don't know why that box keeps popping up, but I bet if I click don't show that message again, I won't have to deal with it anymore. So note how he builds on Shokoff's argument. As we scroll through here, Shokoff is now making his own claim about what's going on in We Are Seven. He's trying to show that the little girl offers one legitimate way of responding to the Newtonian view of the world, particularly the Newtonian view of death. And I want to point out some things here. The way in which he does this. This sentence that I've circled right here is really an analysis of diction, the kinds of things that we've already been talking about this semester. Basically, he's saying, oh, it's interesting that instead of referring to the girl as who or she, the narrator refers to her as that and it. Rather than just pointing that out, though, he then goes on to say, and let me explain to you why that's important. And the reason it's important is that it makes her, in the speaker's mind, part of this universe where everything operates according to the laws of physics. So you can see there he's using the kinds of critical strategies we've already begun to develop. We see further down in this section an analysis of poetic voice. Who is the speaker and what is he like? How does that contrast to the little girl? I'm just going to scroll through a little bit more. One thing I do want you to notice here is the way in which we get an analysis of diction, focusing on the words simple and feels, and then Shokoff saying, wait a minute though, it's not quite that simple. These words have multiple possible meanings, and I need to account for them all. And the ambiguity actually helps him to create his argument. That simple means uncomplicated, direct, and clear, and that Wordsworth may in fact be suggesting that the little girl has a better understanding than the narrator, than the speaker. As we continue, we get what amounts to an analysis of syntax. And I'm sorry for jumping around all over the page here. Nay, we are seven. Shokoff points out that this is a negative word, but that the construction of it grammatically, she is negating not her own idea, but what the speaker has already claimed. So we've moved through We Are Seven. Now we get a new section on this poem, Surprised by Joy. And you probably should expect at this point that we will see an overview of how critics have understood the poem. We'll see that Shokoff himself has a claim about it, and then we'll see evidence presented for that claim. And in fact, that's exactly what we get. I'm going to skip through this one fairly quickly because we haven't read that poem, but I also want to show you a couple of things. Here we have an analysis of sound. The persistent vibrations of the V fricatives, the rumbling of many R's, and the hard stops of T's, P's, B's, and G's all contribute to the sense of a harsh, cold, lifeless world, etc., etc. That's more complex than you're ever going to be asked to give, but I want you to note how Shokoff uses that analysis of sound. And then we get to the conclusion. Often, if you haven't quite yet figured out what the writer's single main point in the essay is, it helps to go to the conclusion. And you should also start training yourself to look for phrases like this one. I have tried to show in this essay. That is often an announcement that the writer's thesis is going to be restated. At the beginning of a paper, you might see, at the beginning of an essay, you might see something like, in this essay I will show, or I will argue. That also a clue that thesis is about to be forthcoming. So I have tried to show in this essay that Wordsworth's purpose, his duty as a poet, was to find consolation for sorrow and death in a world that had been filled with uncertainty by the perceived implications of Newton's discoveries. So a restatement of the thesis. So what can we take from this in terms of figuring out how to read an academic article? A couple of things. First, a good essay has one single point. In this case, the focus on duty. Note that it takes Shokoff probably 20 pages to make this one point. He is thoroughly exploring it. Second, there will be sections of essays. Each section will have its own mini thesis statement, supported by evidence. This is not always going to be the case, but it's a very, very common strategy. Third, evidence consists of analysis of small things. You saw Shokoff analyzing the sounds of words, the syntax, the choices of words that the poet makes. He doesn't do that for the entire poem. I mean, he could have gone through and done what I've asked you to do on your Weebly projects, which is to analyze the diction in the entire poem. Instead, he chooses the points that he believes are significant and focuses on those. So I hope this gives you some sense of how to go about approaching an academic article. Look for that one main point, the writer's thesis. If you grasp that, everything else in the article is simply going to be supporting that one point. Think about how the writer has divided things up into sections and pay careful attention to the evidence that the writer provides. Again, sorry for missing class and sorry for subjecting you to this method of teaching, which is basically me lecturing on a video when you can't even see me, but I figured that's a better use of our time than simply not doing anything today. I will see you in class on Wednesday.